Welcome, everybody, to the Grueling Truth Sports Network. And as always, the Grueling Truth Sports Network is brought to you by betting.net. Betting.net is your best bet for finding the online sportsbook or casino that's right for you. Make sure you check them out at betting.net. I want to remind you, if you're watching this video on YouTube, you can click in the link to the description down below to get the best link to one of the best sportsbooks, Caesar Sportsbooks, for betting on boxing. I'm your host, Mike Goodpaster. Today, we're going to count down the top 10 heavyweights of the 1970s. The 1970s was a great decade for the heavyweight division. You had four all-time great heavyweights of Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, and Larry Holmes that fought for at least half of those decades. You had a long list of legendary contenders. So for my money, the greatest time ever for the heavyweight divisions was the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And unfortunately, it's nothing like that today. But today, we're going to count down the top 10 of the 1970s. My number 10 is a guy that a lot of people would not think of in this list, and that's Joe Buckner. Now, Joe Buckner fought Muhammad Ali twice, and the first attempt fighting Muhammad Ali was a non-title fight in the early 70s in Vegas. Buckner actually fought Ali extremely tough. The second fight at Kuala Lumpur was boring. Buckner really didn't make a dent in Ali. But still, when you look, this was a Brit who was tough as hell. And he fought Joe Frazier. I mean, he gave Frazier all he could handle also. So that'll tell you how good and how talented this guy was. And during the decade of the 70s, he held wins over Henry Cooper, I'll bet an older Henry Cooper, Chuck Wepner, Brian London, Manuel Ramos, Jurgen Blinn, Rudy Lubbers, Mac Foster, Jimmy Ellis. And he lost a close decision to Ron Lyle, I think around 1977 or 78. Buckner was actually ranked in the Ring Magazine heavyweight ratings for over half the decade, or about half of the decade, 1971 to 1976. So my number 10 is Joe Buckner. My number 9 is a man who saw his best time in the 1960s. But number 9 on this list is Jerry Quarry. Irish Jerry Quarry was a tough SOB. In the 1960s, got close to the heavyweight title a couple times. In 1969, probably the fight of the year, I think it was named fight of the year against Joe Frazier. He was stopped at 7 rounds, but it was an absolutely great fight. It was the Hagler-Hearns of the heavyweight division. Now, he still has some success in the 1970s, which is why he's on this list. He knocked out Ernie Shavers in the first round, and he beat Mac Foster. Mac Foster at the time was 24-0 with 24 knockouts. At the time, Quarry beat him. Quarry was listed as the underdog in both fights. In 1974, he lost the fight to Muhammad Ali on cuts. And then 1977, probably his last fight against a name guy, not much of a name guy, was Lorenzo Zanon. And Zanon actually was clearly outboxing Quarry until Quarry knocked him out late in that fight. So number 9 is Jerry Quarry. At number 8, we got one of my favorites. I had a chance to interview him. You can find the link by going to thegruelingtruth.com. I got to interview number 8, which was Ernie Shavers. Great guy, one of the hardest punchers in heavyweight boxing history. And he came close to being the champion on 2 separate occasions in the 1970s. The first was a close decision loss to Muhammad Ali in 1977. And the second time, he came within seconds of beating Larry Holmes before finally being stopped in the 11th round. The shot he hit Holmes with would have probably knocked out about any man not named Larry Holmes or maybe Muhammad Ali that ever lived. And Holmes, showing his greatness, and he's on this list, of course, later on, came back and beat Shavers. Now, to get the rematch against Holmes, because he had fought Holmes basically in a fight to see who would fight Kid Norton for the heavyweight championship, Larry Holmes dominated 1 in 12 rounds. All 12 rounds were competitive, though. And if you haven't seen the fight, go back and check out Holmes Shavers 1. Everybody always watches Holmes Shavers 2. Holmes Shavers 1 is an action fight also. And then to get the rematch against Holmes, he knocked out Kid Norton, who was the number 1 contender at the time, knocked him out in the first round, devastating knockout. He also held wins over Roy Williams, Jimmy Ellis, and Jimmy Young. So number 8 on the list was Ernie Shavers. My number 7 is Ron Lyle. Ron Lyle, great story. He was from Colorado, got out of jail, became a heavyweight contender, fought Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight championship of the world. And Lyle actually was up on 2 to 3 scorecards in 1975 when Ali knocked him out in the 11th round. Lyle held wins over Manuel Ramos, Buster Mathis, Jurgen Blinn, Jimmy Ellis, Oscar Bonavina, Ernie Shavers, of course, as we mentioned before, Joe Buckner, who's number 10 on the list, and Scott Ledoux. And George Foreman knocked him down twice before he knocked George Foreman down twice before him being stopped by Foreman in one of the great heavyweight battles of all time, one of the greatest all-time slugfest you'll ever see. So number 6 on this list, Ron Lyle. Now, at number 5, or number 7 was Ron Lyle. At number 6, we've got Jimmy Young. Now, I would highly suggest you go to gruelingtruth.com and look up the article recently that was written by author John Raspani about the career of Jimmy Young. And bad decisions hurt Young's career. And the one that stands out the most to a lot of people is the losing effort to Ali on points. My only issue with that is there was a lot of ducking and dodging out of the ropes by Young. I really don't think Jimmy Young did enough to win that fight. I know a lot of you out there will disagree with me. A lot of boxing people and fans thought he deserved a decision. But then after that, he got a decision win against George Foreman, which put him in the title contention again before another disputed loss to Ken Norton. He fought Ken Norton. The winner was basically going to fight Larry Holmes for the heavyweight championship of the world. And I really believe that Jimmy Young beat Ken Norton. After that fight, Norton became disillusioned, put on some weight, was never really the same boxer again. But number 6 on the list, once again, was Jimmy Young. Now, real quick, I want to remind everybody to go over and check out for yourself. It's not just sports betting. Betting.net compares the best online casinos, so sit back, relax, play the top online slots, poker, and table games. Make sure you check out the social casinos, especially Funds Points. That's what I just did a video on, which will be out someday. It might even already be out by the time this video is up. But make sure you go check out Funds Point, the social casinos. And the great thing about betting.net is whatever state you live in, when you go on that website, it locates where you are, and it gives you the sports books that are legal to bet on in your state. Now, number 5, Ken Norton. Ken Norton was also a hard luck guy, similar to Jimmy Young. Ken Norton's at number 5 on this list, and he pulled off one of the biggest upsets in heavyweight boxing history when he outpointed Muhammad Ali in 1973. He then lost a split decision in the rematch. And the third fight was another close decision that even today, most people thought Norton won. The second fight, I do think Ali won that fight. The third was a razor close decision. And like I said, most people thought Norton won. I actually did think Ali did just enough to eke it out, winning that final round. But he then goes life and death with Larry Holmes. And, I mean, you could put on the Rocky music when you watch rounds 14 and 15 of Larry Holmes against Ken Norton. That's how great it was. To me, it was the greatest maybe 15th round in heavyweight boxing history, maybe in boxing history, to watch those two men slug it out. Now, he did get a nod over Jimmy Young, which once again, I think Young might have won, but it's hard to ignore Norton's 3 fights there. He fought George Foreman for the heavyweight title, got knocked out in the second round. But as we all know with Ken Norton, if you're a boxing fan, his issue was fighting big punchers. He had difficulty with that. We found that out even later with, Ernie Shavers, who stopped him in the first round. Shavers is also on this list, I think at number 8. So Jimmy Young fought some top-notch competition, had some huge wins. We did have the big losses to Foreman and Shavers, but the 3 fights against Ali and the fight against Holmes are why he's on this list. Now, at number 4, we got one of the toughest guys to ever fight in the sport of boxing, and that's Larry Holmes. And when we look at Larry Holmes, he's 4th on this list because you got 3 guys that are all-time greats. I think he can make a case to be even better than in the top 4 if you look at these guys' careers. And basically the 1970s started off with Larry Holmes as an amateur boxer. And as an amateur boxer in the early 70s, the thing people most remember is getting knocked out by Dwayne Bobbitt in the Olympic box off the Olympic trials. He misses the Olympic team in 72. He becomes a sparring partner for Muhammad Ali. After that, though, his career kind of took off once you get to 1976-77, especially in 77. 1977 is when he beat Ernie Shavers the first time. One of the greatest jabs in boxing history. Ernie Shavers was on top of his game in that first fight, and Larry Holmes still beat him. Now, You then get to fight against Ken Norton, one of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time that we talked about. And then the knockout of Ernie Shavers the second time, which still to this day, I was like 11 or 12 years old at the time in 1979 when they fought. I think it was in November. And Holmes got knocked down. And I really thought Ernie Shavers was going to be the heavyweight champion of the world. I didn't think there was any way any man could humanly get up from the punch Ernie Shavers hit him with. Not only did Holmes get up, Holmes was the one throwing the punches and battering Shavers by the time we got to that end of that round. He also went life or death with the huge underdog, Mike Weaver. If you watch the 1980s top 10 list, which you can find on YouTube, and you can read it on Facebook, or you can read it on thegruelingtruth.com also, but I did a show a few days ago about the top 10 heavyweights of the 1980s. And Mike Weaver was the guy at the time was a huge underdog. We didn't understand until later how good Mike Weaver was. And in 1979 at Madison Square Garden as a huge underdog, he had Holmes in trouble on a couple different occasions. And as Holmes always did, he came back, he bit down on the mouthpiece. He won the fight. And if you watched our top 10 heavyweights in the 1980s, Larry Holmes was number one on that over Mike Tyson, just because of the fact that Larry Holmes was able to overcome all kind of obstacles, especially in the ring. Whenever you knocked him down, it seemed like it woke him up more than had any other effect. All right, now we're going to go to number 3. We get to these top 3 or the top 4. You're getting 4 of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And at number 3, we've got Smokin' Joe Frazier. This is a man whose only losses in his career were to Muhammad Ali and to George Foreman. And he beat Ali in the fight of the century. What are the 3 biggest fights in boxing history? Because I always lump that with Johnson Jeffries because of the racial connotations at the time and the way this country was in the early 1900s. Of course, Louis Schmeling, too, because of Nazi Germany, Max Schmeling against Joe Louis, the American, and how a lot of white Americans actually cheered for Joe Louis in that fight. Ali Frazier won was the fight of the century. I don't remember it in person. I was like 3 years old at the time, but I do know this. When you watch that fight, I think on that night, March the 15th, 1971, Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali were the 2 greatest heavyweights that ever lived. The skill that they both showed, the defensive ability, the punching power they both had was remarkable. And of course, Ali knocks Frazier down, or Frazier knocks Ali down in the 11th round, hurts him a couple other times, wins the decision, which rightfully he should have. Then, though, he defends against Terry Daniels and a very tough Ron Stander. Ron Stander's a guy that actually beat Ernie Shavers around that time, but he dominated both of those guys. He lost his title to George Foreman in the second round, but then he comes back. He fights Ali in the second fight, which I think he lost handily. Ali Frazier 3, still one of the greatest heavyweight title fights of all time. People thought Frazier had nothing left and Ali would destroy him. Ali did beat him. He definitely didn't destroy him. If anything, they probably destroyed each other. And then he fought a rematch against George Foreman. I'll never forget he came out bald. He actually made a better attempt or looked better in the second fight than he did the first, but George Foreman stopped him, and I think it was the 5th or 6th round. Pretty much retired till then. He came back in 1980, fought Floyd Jumbo Cummings, who was a journeyman fighter. Ended up being a draw. And that was pretty much the end of Joe Frazier there. But our number 3 is Smokin' Joe Frazier, a man who doesn't get near the credit that he deserves. At number 2, Big George Foreman. Big George Foreman may have been the most intimidating heavyweight in the history of boxing. He was truly a force of nature, knocked out everybody. I mean, he stopped George Chuvalo. Not many people ever did that. Stopped him in the 3rd round. And no matter what anybody tells you, if they don't stop that fight, George Chuvalo was going to be knocked out. He got the title shot against Joe Frazier, which at the time was considered a mismatch. A lot of people thought Joe Frazier was going to destroy George Foreman. They thought Foreman was too green and wouldn't be able to deal with Joe Frazier. He knocks Frazier down 7 times. Of course, you got the down goes Frazier from Howard Cosell that everybody remembers. Then he knocks out Ken Norton in the 2nd round. He knocks out Jose Roman in the 1st round. Then he fights Muhammad Ali, and a lot of people thought that was a mismatch. That was similar to Foreman-Frazier, only Foreman was the big, heavy favorite this time. And Ali basically outsmarts him and beats him. And really, George Foreman was never the same after that during the 70s. And, he had wins against guys like Scott Ledoux after that, who he stopped. But in 1977 in Puerto Rico, he was beaten by the very slick Jimmy Young, who's number 6 on this list. Young even dropped him during that fight. And George Foreman would retire after that fight in 1977. That's the one where he said, laying in the dressing room, he was dehydrated. He saw God. That changed his life. And from there, of course, the rest is history. He makes a comeback a decade later. And almost 20 years after he loses, well, it was 20 years after he lost his title to Muhammad Ali, he regained it back with a win over Michael Moore. All right, number one, guys, I think is no doubt number one of the 1970s heavyweights is Muhammad Ali. Now, the Ali of the 60s was probably more talented. He was faster. He was stronger. He dominated everybody. Very rarely lost a round. I think what makes Muhammad Ali the greatest heavyweight of all time was the fact that the Ali of the 1970s was not nearly as fast. He had to figure out a way to beat guys. And when you look at this top 10 list here, we go through it. He beats George Foreman. He wins 2 out of 3 against Joe Frazier. Didn't fight Holmes in the 70s. Of course, by the time he fought him in the 1980s, he was a shell of his former self. He beats Norton 2 out of 3. He beat Young. He stopped Lyle. He beat Shavers. He beat Quarry. He beat Buckner twice. Everybody on this top 10 list, except for Larry Holmes, who he didn't fight in the 70s, and he eventually did fight him in the 80s. The thing that was great about Ali, he didn't duck anybody. And all 9 fighters on this list, he fought, and he fought a lot of them multiple times. He was never afraid to risk anything. In the end, that may have been a bad thing, but when you look back at the greatest heavyweights of all time, this is the guy. I mean, he knocked out Foreman, beat Frazier too. I mean, we just went through this. And you add on top of that, the 70s were so loaded. He also beats Jimmy Ellis, Buster Mathis. Leon Spinks, of course, upset him as a 7-1 underdog in 1977, 78. But then he comes back and he dominated Spinks at a rematch. Ali fought everybody who was anybody in the 1970s, and he beat everybody on this list, guys. So I think this is one time I don't think anybody can dispute the top 10 list that we come up with for tonight, or that I came up for the 1970s. So once again, our list for the top 10 heavyweights of the 1970s was Joe Buckner at number 10, Jerry Quarry at number 9, Ernie Shavers at number 8. And for the people that say Quarry knocked Shavers out in the first round, for the totality of the decade, you also had Shavers giving Ali all he could handle. He fought him tougher than Quarry did, even though it was an older version of Ali. But you also had the Shavers knockout against, Ken Norton. You had the 2 epic fights against Larry Holmes. That's why he's ahead of Jerry Quarry there. Number 7, we've got Ron Lyle. Number 6, you've got Jimmy Young. Number 5, Ken Norton. Number 4, Larry Holmes. Number 3, Joe Frazier. Number 2, George Foreman. And number 1, of course, Muhammad Ali. All right, guys. It's always great doing these. And I want to remind you to head over now and see for yourself. Betting.net makes it easy to find all the legal online casinos or sports books in your state. Check them out at betting.net. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our top 10 heavyweights of the 1970s show. Keep a lookout for the top 10 heavyweights of the 1990s, which will be coming up in a few days. But for now, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been watching and listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends